I'm beyond honored to be able to put on events such as this and chat with such amazing writers, and I'm constantly inspired by this community. We're joined tonight by three wonderful writers for a conversation about how and why we reimagine popular fairy tales, classics, and mythologies. Our first panelist is Kalynn Bayron. Kalynn Bayron is the New York Times bestselling author of young adult novels Cinderella is Dead, This Poison Heart, This Wicked Fate, You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight, and Sleep Like Death, and the middle grade Vanquishers series. She is a classically trained vocalist and grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. When she's not writing, you can hear her listening to Ella Fitzgerald on loop, attending the theater, watching scary movies, and spending time with her kids. She currently lives in Ithaca, New York with her family. You can find her at www.kalynnbayron.com or at Kalynn Bayron. Thank you so much for being here. Our next panelist is Gabe Cole Novoa. He is a Latinx transmasculine, award-winning New York Times bestselling author who writes speculative fiction featuring marginalized characters grappling with identity. Now leveled up with an MFA in writing for children, when he isn't buried under his two cats, you'll likely find him knitting or crocheting something cute. Gabe is the author of Most Ardently, a Pride and Prejudice retelling, The Wicked Bargain, The Diablo's Curse, These Vengeful Gods, and the Beyond the Red trilogy, written under a former pseudonym. You can find him across a variety of social media sites at the Gabe Cole. And finally, we have Vaishnavi Patel is the New York Times bestselling author of Kaikeyi and Goddess of the River. Her novels have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Condé Nast Traveler, Bustle, and more. She is a lawyer specializing in civil rights litigation, including issues of gender and racial injustice. 10 Incarnations of Rebellion is her third novel. Thank you all so much for being here. Before we jump into our discussion, I want to let our audience know that we will be collecting questions and will dedicate some time at the end of the program to answering them. Please submit any and all questions you have on tonight's topic. If you want to do so, navigate to your Zoom toolbar, which is typically at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a Q&A option. You'll click that and submit your question there. But enough from me. Let's get to why we're all really here, our three wonderful panelists. Without further ado, let's talk about the process of retelling well-known stories. I'd love it if you could start off by each of you telling us a bit about your own retellings. What stories have you adapted, and what did you change about the original stories? Kalynn, let's start with you.
Sure. I've done a few. My debut was a Cinderella reimagining, but I've kind of retold, reimagined Cinderella, Snow White, Jekyll and Hyde, with My Dear Henry, and very loosely The Secret Garden and some Greek mythology in there. I think that, and also my new book that's coming out in September, Make Me a Monster, is a Frankenstein inspired story. But I think that with nearly everything that I've done, I have added Black and queer people to the mix, and not just for funsies as main characters with stories that are nuanced and have a lot of depth to them. And we don't always get to see ourselves, especially if we're retelling fairy tales and kind of classic literature. We're not always present in those spaces to begin with. And so I think that having these, doing these stories, retelling these types of stories really gives us a chance to have a conversation. I think there is sometimes this thought that we're writing these stories to replace the classics or replace fairy tales, but I don't think of it like that at all. I think of it as a conversation. And so that's kind of what I'm doing with my work. And I'm always just thinking of how I can diversify these tales and make them more accessible to people like me and the people in my community.
I love that. I love a conversation. How about you, Gabe? What have you retold, and what did you change about the stories?
Yeah, so I wrote Most Ardently, a Pride and Prejudice remix, which I've been describing as Pride and Prejudice, but trans and gay. So in my retelling, the second eldest, Bennett, is a trans boy and Darcy is gay. So while Most Ardently follows a lot of the main beats of the original story, there were, of course, necessary changes throughout because making a protagonist a gay trans boy fundamentally changes the story. And so that was really fun to explore. And that's the only one I've retold so far. But I did recently get to announce that I'll be sharing a retelling of Persuasion that will also be gay and trans and for adults in a year or two. So, yeah,
Congratulations. That's really
thank you.
exciting. How about you, Vaishnavi?
Yeah, so my first two books were more of like pure retellings of the two big Indian epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, from the perspective of women who were sidelined in the story. So my first book, Kaikeyi, is from the evil stepmother character's perspective, and my second novel, Goddess of the River, is from the perspective of a river goddess who is cursed to become human. My third book just came out. It's called 10 Incarnations of Rebellion, and it's not an exact retelling, but it uses the mythological framework of the 10 incarnations of Vishnu, who's one of the major Hindu gods, as the frame for telling the story of India's independence movement in an alternate history setting. So, thus far, my first three are all retellings or retelling-ish, but my next one, which is unannounced, will be finally moving out of that space.
How is 10 Incarnations of Rebellion just came out, didn't it?
Yes, in June.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So, to all of you, let's start with you, Gabe. What was it about Pride and Prejudice that spoke to you and felt primed for a retelling? And what was your relationship to the source text before you started rewriting it? And how did that evolve as the writing process continued?
Yeah, so Pride and Prejudice stood out to me because of how much I could relate to the original story. So, like Elizabeth, I was raised in a home full of girls with very strict expectations of what a woman should be like, that never really sat right with me. And so, doing a retelling with Elizabeth as a trans boy made all the sense in the world to me because it was, in some ways, my own story of growing up. And so once I began plotting and exploring what it might be like to turn Pride and Prejudice into a queer story, I was delighted to find how much of the groundwork was already laid out for me. So Darcy's infamous dislike of dances, for example, became much easier to understand if he was a gay boy feeling forced to court a life that he knew would never make him happy. And finding nuances like that in the original story that I could like really explore and blow up into like full-on queer narratives just made the original text feel more meaningful and relatable to me in ways that made diving into the story even more rewarding. And I do find it somewhat amusing because as a teenager, I was not super interested in Pride and Prejudice or most classics, to be honest. And like my very first exposure was actually the 2005 adaptation. And so I was like aware of like cultural context and stuff, but it wasn't really until that I started considering like the prospect of delving into classics and finding my own story through them that I was able to really attach to the story and get to know it in ways that I like teenage me never would have imagined. So the whole thing just felt very rewarding in ways that I think were even surprising to me as I was moving along with it.
That's amazing. That's awesome. Kalynn, how about you? What drew you to which of yours was most recent? Was it My Dear Henry was out most recently or Cinderella is Dead?
Yeah, My Dear Henry is probably the most recent.
Hmm.
Well, kind of setting aside a book that comes out in September, but
Yes.
yeah. So
I
I
would love for
can
you
I
to
can speak
touch
to
on
that. Yeah,
My Dear Henry, but I also would like you to touch on your fairy tales, of what drew you to those stories
yeah.
specifically, and how your relationship with them changed as you were writing.
Yeah, so for My Dear Henry, which is a remix of Jekyll and Hyde, I read it. So I read it for the very first time when I was in college, and I remember there being this discussion kind of going on about kind of the duality of man and how we all have this, this kind of animalistic side. We all have this this monster inside of us. And I was someone who was still kind of thinking about my own, my own sexuality, my own things in my life. And I felt like it was such a clear allegory for the other, for queerness specifically for me, that I've thought about this story in those terms ever since then. And when I had the opportunity to write My Dear Henry, I got to revisit the story and really see those parallels. But again, My Dear Henry centers queer Black boys, which changes everything because we're talking about a story that is set in the late 1800s in London. And there's this whole other conversation, this whole other kind of cultural conversation that we're having about that. Also, just kind of getting to revisit that story helped me to kind of redefine the things in my retellings and remixes that are important to me, which is kind of holding up a mirror and saying we can also be present in these spaces. And so I love a good Gothic horror novel. It's one of my favorite genres. Clearly, lots of things that I retell are, retellings of those kind of classic stories. Frankenstein being one of them. And so, it for me, it really is about kind of connecting these stories to myself and then to a wider audience by bringing in characters that are more like the people that I see in my community.
Mm-hmm. Vaishnavi, how about you? What drew you to the Dashavatara and to Indian mythology in general, and how has your relationship with that mythology changed as you have written your works?
Yeah, so I'll start with Kaikeyi and Goddess of the River, and then I'll go to 10 Incarnations. But Kaikeyi especially was a story that brought me closer to my religion and to my cultural heritage, because I was able to confront the things that as a child made me so uncomfortable about these stories. So I'm tackling specifically religious stories that are part of beliefs and practice that still exist today. And so the Ramayana is a religious text about a god for many people. And as a kid, I was really troubled by the Ramayana's treatment of women and the way that they were brushed aside or villainized, and the purity tests that happen at the end of the novel. And it made me feel distance from those stories, and it made me feel alienated from my religion, as did general issues of patriarchy that are present in every religion. And coming back to the story to retell it from the perspective of a woman who is just assumed to be jealous and evil and irrational actually made me feel closer, because I went and I read the translation of the original text, and I realized that a lot of the problems that I saw in the story were additions that had come into the story, or glosses that had been put on the story through thousands of years of retelling. And the originals were different. And I also learned that there are so many versions of this story out there outside of the mainstream version that were being pushed aside for this kind of conglomerate, centralized story, which was never what Hinduism was originally about. It was very tolerant of people having different interpretations. And so realizing that I could have my interpretation of these stories and that they could coexist, and that I could reclaim or rewrite the parts that were so troubling, brought me really close to the actual epics and to my culture. And that was it was a beautiful experience. And I hope that there's readers who have had a similar experience when interacting with it. With 10 Incarnations of Rebellion, that was a historical alternate history type of story. And I knew I wanted to bring myth into it, because my first two books were mythological, and I love the mythological stories. And I was really fascinated by the Dashavtar, which literally translates to 10 incarnations of Vishnu, and how they mirror the evolution of life and then of human civilization. And I thought that would be such an interesting way to frame a coming of age story when the protagonist starts out really rudimentary and then ends up, becoming her own person. And so I named the main character after the 10th incarnation of Vishnu, so that at the very end, the final chapter was like her own. And so it was it was more referential than retelling in the sense of it so loosely followed the 10 incarnations of Vishnu that I can't actually claim it as a retelling, but it was still like within my roots.
That makes sense. Uh, when you were talking about your first two novels, I felt very drawn to it, and it actually, I think, led very well into my next question, which is there's this long history of retelling stories, from oral traditions to Dante's Inferno to every adaptation of Greek mythology that is floating around our world at the moment. And I'd love to stick with you, Vaishnavi, for a little and ask you, why do humans retell stories at all from like a bigger perspective? Why do you think?
That's such a deep question. And when I saw this on the question list, I thought, oh God, I could spend like years trying to answer it and never come with a satisfactory answer. But I think part of it, there's maybe two parts. One is that there's just these plot beats or ideas or themes that are so universal that everything is inspired by everything else. And a great example is that India has these two big epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and one is a long journey home, and one is a war. And that is also the Odyssey and the Iliad, even though they were two different places and times, definitely not influenced by each other. The Ramayana predates Homer by like a long time, but these two universal stories became the centerpieces of two different cultures and religions separated by so much time and space. And that's because the journey and the yearning for home and war and the horrors of it are just these universal experiences that are so shared that you keep coming back to them. And so, of course, if you have stories that are doing a really good job of tackling these themes, you're going to want to keep engaging. I think the other piece is that stories are often repositories of cultural knowledge and religious knowledge in the case of many of the epics. And so they become a part of the fabric of life. At least in India, even today, it's so common for you to hear the stories first from your parent or grandparent telling you random parts of the epics at lunch or dinner or on a festival day. You hear the stories orally because they're so important. But when somebody tells you the story orally, they're retelling it. Even if they try to stay as faithful as possible to the details, it is a retelling. The things that they think are important and the voices that they want to put into the story are what comes through. So I think that the transmittal of stories because we love them necessarily turns into retelling the stories, and that's why I felt comfortable kind of putting my voice into it, because the reason the story still exists is because it was retold for 3,000 years. So one more retelling isn't going to hurt it.
That's amazing. It's what I wanted out of an answer to that question. I would love to keep talking about it. Gabe, conceptually, why do you think that humans retell stories?
Yeah, I think there are so many reasons, and it also depends, I think, partially on like the time that the retelling is being told. And so I wanted to focus more on like why I in particular felt it was important.
Hmm.
And so for me, retelling a classic from a queer lens felt really important because so many queer and trans people feel shut out of the classics canon, which is, I know, something Kalynn was also, touching on as well. And my goal with Most Ardently was to write a story that would give trans and queer people the same fuzzy, warm feelings that cishet readers have enjoyed from Pride and Prejudice for centuries. And so I said as much in my dedication, which was to my trans siblings, we deserve romances that sweep us off our feet too. That's why this book is written for you. And so I think bringing fresh perspectives to classics with books written by and starring people of color, queer people, disabled people, can help make these stories feel more relatable and interesting to young marginalized people today who would not have otherwise felt adequately represented in these stories and therefore may not be interested in these stories. And, I do think that was a big part of why classics just never interested me as a teen. I read them through high school and even college, through whenever I had to for mandatory reading, but like it didn't really stick with me until I realized that like I could do my own versions with people who felt like me and people who looked like me. And that's what started to make them feel more alive to me. And so, as we've said before too, it's not so much about like writing new versions or like replacing them. I think it's more about finding new ways to look at them and finding ways to make them feel relatable so that, somebody might read one that has a character that actually feels like them and shares their experience. And maybe that will open up the interest to look at other retellings or look at the originals and look at other books that are, similar that you can then branch out your interest in ways that wouldn't have been accessible without that story beforehand.
I love that. And that was my experience reading Most Ardently as well.
Yeah.
Um, Kalynn, how about you? Why do you think that humans retell stories? And what?
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to think of storytelling as this very kind of like fluid thing. It feels like this living, breathing thing. We take our kind of lived experiences and our knowledge of the past and kind of our hopes for the future, and we repaint these familiar stories with that brush. Um, I I think that there's something really powerful about that. There's something about being able to take something that feels very familiar. I also think that people just crave things that feel familiar. But there's these retellings are kind of a new way of looking at these very familiar stories. I think that's why a lot of us have these kind of guideposts within our stories to kind of help you recognize that we are, yes, we're doing a retelling, a remix, but this is its own thing. So I think that retellings speak directly to our shared storytelling past. It is what we do as human beings throughout all cultures, all over the world. We tell stories, we pass knowledge, and we remember where we came from, and we think about where we're going, all through storytelling. It is incredibly powerful, and I think that's why we do it. And this is what I talk about when I go on school visits and I talk to young readers, and I tell them what I do is just a continuation of what people have been doing for thousands of years, which is sharing stories, sharing knowledge. And when they look at it in this kind of, they look at it in this kind of global context, I think it makes us feel connected, and that's what we all want.
Thank you. And thank you so much, all three of you, for entertaining my conceptual question. I think that it's really interesting to kind of set the stage of why and how we're thinking about these things. As we are the Writers League of Texas, I'm going to go a little bit more into the weeds of what the writing looks like, and what it looked like for you and your retellings. And so to start us off with that, I would love to ask you all how your initial writing process was different when you were taking a story that was retold in terms of outlining and world building. And what did you decide to keep intact from the original work? And at what point were you twisting or reimagining specific details? Um, Kalynn, can we continue on with you?
Sure, yeah. So I think that for me, it really is about those guideposts that I was talking about before. With the retelling, with the reimagining, I think there is some expectation that there's going to be something recognizable in a story. If I'm telling a story, if I'm retelling Cinderella, there's going to be some kind of recognizable thing from Cinderella. And I struggle with that because I sometimes think about this, what I write is usually for me first and then readers kind of second. But sometimes it's for both of us at the same time. And so when I'm doing a retelling, I do think about reader expectations to weigh that against the story that I want to tell. But I really kind of think it depends on the setup, because there are, is it a retelling? Is it a reimagining? Is it a remix? Is it a beat for beat retelling of an earlier version of the story? But I think that no matter what it is, there is room for originality, and that's kind of what I try to lean into. I can completely kind of reimagine the world of Cinderella and set a story in the center of that. I can kind of take Jekyll and Hyde, and I can look at a minor character and maybe make that person the center or the focus. I really think it's about kind of shifting the lens a little bit, taking that original story or a version, because many of these stories don't have one single original version. That's that kind of retelling of the story that we were talking about earlier. But I will try to look at that story and make sure that there are signposts that are recognizable. But other than that, I really lean into the story that I'm trying to tell. What am I trying to say with this retelling? Is there what is the theme that I'm trying to get across? And that's where my focus is when I'm doing a retelling. When I'm doing an original story, I still have that same focus, but it feels a little less, I don't want to say restrictive, but there are things that I can do with an original story that maybe I don't choose to do with a retelling or a remix. And that for me is just making sure that some of those signposts are there, so that if you pick up a story about Cinderella, it's not so completely away from Cinderella that you're like, what did I even pick this up for? So yeah, but that's just my own kind of personal process.
Thank you for sharing it. Vaishnavi, how about you? How is your initial writing process different when you're retelling a story, outlining and world building? And how do you decide to keep details from the original work versus reimagine them?
Yeah, so I knew I wanted to write a fairly quote unquote faithful retelling, in the sense of, or at least for my first two, that they were set in the same world of ancient India, and that they had that setting and feeling, and that the twist on it was going to be that you were going to be getting the inner thought and inner life of these characters that previously had been sidelined. And so for me, my process started with reading the original translations and researching the different versions that exist throughout South and Southeast Asia. And that was the foundation on which I then built to tell the story. So I kind of operated from the assumption that I was going to keep everything. And then when I took something out or I changed something, I always had to make sure for myself and for my readers that I had a reason for it. So if there's a detail that's changed, it's going to be for a particular purpose. And I think that really gave me the structure to play inside for those retellings. And I think that was because of my particular purpose in telling the story, which was to explore why these women might have made the choices that they did, and what life story led them to the few moments that we actually see in the epic. And so it was more about filling in the details that the epic doesn't give us, that would still then be plausibly functioning within the rest of the epic. So I think my process was using the epic's plot beats as an outline, and then filling in and changing only when I needed to. But I did then change some things once I had my head around it. A big one, I'll give an example from Kaikeyi because that's the oldest. But in the Ramayana, there's a main villain. His name is Ravan, and he's a demon, and he's the one who Ram, of the titular Ramayana, ultimately fights and defeats at the end of the epic. And Kaikeyi is the secondary villain. She is the evil stepmother who exiles Ram and sends him on this whole journey that ends with him killing the Demon King. And so in the epic, Kaikeyi and Ravan never meet, because why would they? One is at the beginning of the story and one's at the end of the story, and never the twain shall meet. But in Kaikeyi, I wanted to give Robin a chance to get a little more complexity, even though he's still an antagonistic force in my view. He has some more dimensionality to him, and the way you see that is because early in the story, when they were when both Kaikeyi and Robin were plausibly still alive and around, they meet, and that never happens in the Ramayana. That's a change, but it like doesn't break the plot of the story, of the actual story, to have them do that. So I get to bring these characters from other parts of the epic in and give them their own tragic backstory. So that was kind of how I thought about it.
Thank you. Gabe, how about you? How was your initial writing process different, and what did you decide to keep and or to change?
Yeah, so I think for me, the biggest difference is in how I start. So for an original work, I don't always know necessarily like what it is that I'm setting out to tell, like what story it is that I'm setting out to tell, or what my goal is with that particular story until I've gone through a couple drafts. And that's often where I'll like start to hone in and realize like, okay, this is like the major theme here. And like, this is what I really want to pull in, and this is where I want to work. But and of course that varies story to story. It's not always true that way, but oftentimes that is my process for an original story. Whereas with the retelling, I'm generally start with what it is that I want to accomplish. And so being able to have that goal in mind allowed me to really look at the original work and then think about what do I want to change? How do I want to change it? So for most ardently, I knew I wanted to stick fairly close to the original story, which meant sticking to the same time period and a very similar setting. It's still in England, but I chose to set it in London rather than the countryside for logistical reasons. And so, with characters also who behave similarly to the original story. But since I was changing a fundamental aspect of the story, that the protagonist is a gay trans boy rather than a cishet woman, that necessitated changes to the plot. So I asked myself where the story had to deviate from the original in order to show Oliver's life as a trans boy and have a chance to explore who he is. And I had to think about how the events of the original story would affect Oliver differently than it did the original Elizabeth, just because of how different they were as protagonists. And so this gave me a guiding thread to go through the major plot points and really flesh out Oliver's story while still nodding back to the original story throughout. And finding that balance was definitely one of the most challenging aspects for me. But as long as I had that guiding thread, it really helped inform a lot of my decisions so that I felt like I could reach a good balance between a story that was original and the story that I wanted to tell, but was still recognizably Pride and Prejudice.
That makes sense. That's awesome. My next question is, because these stories often exist in multiple iterations already, how did you decide which versions to incorporate or to pay attention to when you're creating your own? And or did you focus on a single source version or multiple versions? Kalynn, I'd love to hear your answer to this first. You talked already that like especially your fairy tales don't have a beginning. So I'd love to hear what you had to say.
Yeah, I for my fairy tale reimaginings, I collect as many versions as I can possibly get my hands on. I like to find as many as I can, and I like to kind of read them and think about the threads that run through that are similar. I like to, but the ones that I'm drawn to are the ones that are kind of outliers, the ones that don't fit in with all of the other ones. There seems to be something there. I feel like there's always a story there, a good story to kind of uncover. I think that especially when I was researching for this Poison Heart, which has Greek mythology woven into the story. I was looking at the story of Medea, and the story that I know is that this is a woman scorned, and because of her feelings, she killed her own two children, and that is what is kind of synonymous with her story and her name. But when I was researching for this Poison Heart, I found two other iterations of this story that came before that version, where one of them, she accidentally kills her children, thinking that she puts them in the temple and is hoping that they'll become immortal. And then there's another version where the townspeople are actually responsible for the deaths of the children. And I think it's quite interesting which version, stuck. So for me, I took those earlier versions, and those were the ones that I decided to kind of reincorporate into my story of her lineage and her motivations and the kind of misinformation about her, because I felt like there was a story there to tell about what kinds of stories we tell ourselves about angry women and how we're portrayed throughout history. So for me, it's really about collecting as much information as possible and really finding where there's a good kind of entry point for these retellings.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. Vaishnavi, how about you? You mentioned going back to original translations. I'd love to hear more about your process for choosing what you were pulling from.
Absolutely. So I love talking about this because I find Ramayana and Mahabharata history so fascinating. But essentially what you have with both of those epics, but especially the Ramayana, is a story that was orally transmitted for some amount of time and then was memorialized in a written piece of work, the Valmiki's Ramayana, and then was continually retold because most people didn't read the language, didn't have access to those texts throughout communities, in parallel to the preservation of this text and the writing of more texts that purported to be translations into new languages, but often themselves made somewhat massive changes depending on which version you're looking at. And so you have this kind of branching, this narrowing into the one, and then this massive branching and proliferation. So there are versions where Ram doesn't kill Ravan, his brother kills Ravan. There's versions where, and I adapted some of these into my version, where Ravan is the father of one of the younger main characters. There's versions where Ravan is actually kind of the hero because if you come from regions where historically his kingdom was, they have a much more positive spin on his story. So and every detail in between can be, and already has been changed. So there's this seminal essay called The 300 Ramayans that made a big splash in Hindu and Sanskrit studies several decades ago. But it's actually probably more like 10, 15, 20,000 Ramayans if you really collect all of the different regional language variations, tribal variations. It's massive. And so I knew there was going to be a limit to how much I could learn about the different versions because I was simply never going to be able to consume a 1,000-page epic 10,000 times. So I focused on learning the original and then reading key parts of other major versions. So if I wanted to add complexity to Ravan, I read the versions in which he was the anti-hero or maybe even the hero. If I wanted to have more about Ram's brother in this book, I read the versions where Ram's brother was more of a main character. And so on and so forth. And then at some point, I just accepted that there were going to be versions that I hadn't read, and that had to be okay. So for me, the versioning, what I think was interesting about my process of learning about this is that in India today and in Hinduism today, the Valmiki Ramayana is held up as like the perfect, pristine version, and everything else is an adulteration. But when you drill down into what communities actually believe and practice, that's not the case at all. And in fact, so many people in India come to the Ramayana through the famous TV series that came out in the 80s, or through the movies or the cartoons. There are just a million ways that people consume it. And so the idea that this story can be distilled into one single perfect text is one that I really reject and have tried to reject in writing and in thinking about it. but it was definitely eye-opening because I learned that as a kid too.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, so that's so daunting. And I applaud the work that you put into it. Gabe, I would love to hear about your process. It feels like there's a new Pride and Prejudice like every couple of years. And then, of course, you mentioned already the 2005 movie. How did you choose?
Yeah, so with Ardently, I largely focused on the original when I was creating my version, with some exceptions, including the 2005 movie adaptation. But the original was where I really paid attention to like plot and character and language. But since the 2005 adaptation is so deeply embedded into pop culture, I also paid attention to the most popular moments in the movie, so I could like better consider what it was that made those moments so especially memorable. And so before I began writing, I did read a couple retellings just to kind of like get a sense for how some people have approached Pride and Prejudice retellings before. I certainly didn't try to read all of them because I said there's so many. But ultimately, it was the original book and some moments from the adaptation that proved to be the most helpful sources of inspiration for me. So that's what I kept going back to from the very beginning of plotting and thinking about how I wanted to adapt different characters and thinking about how people spoke about the characters and like what stood out to them and what made them famous or infamous, as the case may be. And then, throughout revisions of when I was thinking about language more and I was thinking more about like, what moments do I want to nod back to? What lines do I want to nod back to? And so it really came back to those two. But that said, having the understanding of what's already out there and being able to continue to consume other versions and like get a sense for what do people even do with retellings, even just in the YA space there are so many to look at, was also just like really helpful for me to just get a sense for what does it look like to tackle a retelling to begin with.
That makes sense too. That's awesome. I want to move on to cold hard logistics. I'm going to ask you guys how marketing a retelling is different than marketing an original story. Gabe, I'd love to hear you continue to speak on this.
Yeah, sure. So in a lot of ways, I actually found marketing retelling easier than marketing an original story, because it gave me a really easy framework for pitching my retelling. So I didn't have to explain like the full premise of an original story to pull readers in and what it was about this story they've never heard of that might interest them. Instead, I could reference the original and then highlight what made my retelling different. So I found my pitch of Pride and Prejudice except gay, basically, or Pride and Prejudice except trans, to be like pretty effective in quickly getting a premise across and intriguing readers with a familiar story, while also explaining why this story might interest some people who perhaps weren't interested in the original Pride and Prejudice. And so I found in some ways how I spoke about the story to be like much easier because of that template that I could kind of work with already. Whereas with original stories, I find figuring out how to talk about it to be like one of the most difficult aspects of marketing for me personally. So that was like a nice surprise and also probably one of the only things I would say were easier. But I think for me at least, just being able to have some template to work with at the very beginning that didn't require working from a blank page necessarily and being able to just directly say like, hey, it's kind of like this, but this is what makes it different. Just
Mhm.
made it a lot easier and also made it, instantly recognizable for people who were already interested in awesome stories.
Makes sense. How about you, Caitlin?
Yeah, I feel similarly. There's definitely that kind of name recognition for some of these stories, and I think that that's extremely helpful. And whether it's fairy tales or mythology, there's that kind of people who are already interested in that are might be drawn to the story that way. And also, we just don't have to spend, at least in my case, didn't have to spend quite as much time kind of nailing down the vibe, like if this is Make Me a Monster is Frankenstein. So if this is a gothic, creeping dread, atmospheric tale, we kind of we know that ahead of time. And so I think I think it's helpful. And I think that anything that works in publishing to make things a little easier is always is always welcome. But I also think that there's an aspect of, and I was kind of talking about this before, but approaching these stories as conversation starters or conversation with their earlier versions, their earlier iterations, because if you dislike Jekyll and Hyde, this story might have something to offer you. And if you love Jekyll and Hyde, then there might be something for this story to offer you. So I think that framing it that way with that kind of conversation was a key point for us. Yeah.
Vaishnavi, how about you? How is marketing different from marketing an original story?
So when I went into marketing my retellings, I had no idea how that compared to marketing an original story because I really only had that experience with 10 Incarnations of Rebellion. But I actually feel that for me, because the story I was retelling is not very well known in the Western world, it led to this almost bifurcated marketing strategy where we were targeting South Asian readers who were familiar with the story with the hook. It's a retelling of the Ramayana from Kaikeyi's perspective, which is a sentence that makes sense to them, but probably not if you're a non-South Asian American person. It's just like, okay. So that for that side of things, it was marketed as Indian myth retelling with an evil stepmother character, hearkening to these other more familiar stories, like, oh, it's an epic, so you know what you're getting into, and it's an evil stepmother character, so you know what you're getting into there. And so the marketing almost was from scratch in many ways. I think where the actual difference was that with Kaikeyi especially, it really hit a niche in the South Asian market among South Asian women specifically who were looking for a story about their epics and engaging with some of the issues in the original. And so the word of mouth marketing became a huge part of it because you could easily pitch it to your other Desi friends by saying, it's a Ramayana retelling from the perspective of Kaikeyi, and they got it right away and they would think, oh wow, I really want to see that. And so when the word of mouth among the group that knew the original came about, that was when I think I really felt the power of retelling versus an original story. But I think for the rest of the market, I was it was a retelling, but we had to pitch it as though it wasn't.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting about word of mouth marketing as well. That resonated.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you all, of course, when you're playing off of these stories, you're playing off of reader expectations, and people are coming into your stories with a preconceived notion of what it's going to be about. Has anything surprised you about reader responses to your stories? Kalynn, let's start with you again.
So I think the thing that surprises me, I feel like most of the reception to these retellings has been really great, and I want to highlight that. But I think the thing that irks me, I guess, is that when I'm retelling a story like Jekyll and Hyde, with My Dear Henry, there's this kind of thought that Black people or queer people didn't exist in this time period at this time, and or when I'm doing a fairy tale retelling, that it's almost inconceivable to some people that the main character could be a queer Black girl, that the princess could be a queer Black girl. And so I think the responses, which people are very free with and very determined to make me see through my DMs and emails and all sorts of things, there's this kind of response to my work that is not great, and that is something that I've learned to deal with. My debut was Cinderella is Dead, and this has just been kind of par for the course for me. But I will say that that with with all stories, there is a place for people like me and the people in my community. And so every time that I redo one of these stories and I place us at the center, it's not an act of charity. It's because we belong there. And so those kind of responses from people who are confused or you know, upset about that, those are the ones that I'm kind of like, well, wait a minute, I'm just telling a story. I'm just telling a story to kind of make people feel seen, and I know where that's coming from. I understand that deeply, but the work is the work, and making my young readers feel seen is more important. And so um, so those are the things that kind of surprise me, that people still feel the need to tell me. You can feel however you want to feel, but the need to reach out and tell me these things
Hmm.
can be daunting and disheartening. But it's something that unfortunately is kind of par for the course with this kind of work for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Gabe, how about you?
Yeah, so dealing with reader expectations, I think, was honestly one of the hardest parts while I was writing most ardently. Because, of course, from the very beginning, I was keenly aware of just how popular Pride and Prejudice is and how vast the fandom is. So naturally, I felt a lot of pressure around what reader expectations may be like, while also aware that it would be impossible to make every Pride and Prejudice fan happy. And so ultimately, the solution for me was to figure out what exactly my goal was with Most Ardently, and then stick with that goal and remind myself of what I had set out to do while I was drafting and revising. And I found that that was a really successful strategy for me because I do feel I accomplished what I set out to do, which made it a lot easier for me to accept that it was just going to be impossible to make everybody happy. And I was okay with that because I did what I wanted to do. Um, and so I wouldn't say that like I've had reader responses that have surprised me. But I will say, on the nicer ends of things, it has been nice to see how Most Ardently has resonated with queer and trans readers in particular. You know, it really does mean a lot to me after putting so much of my own experience as a queer trans person into the story to see others recognize themselves in Oliver and feel validated by his love story, or recognize a loved one and find that the story made it easier for them to understand somebody that they know. And like those responses have just been so special to me and, you know, really validated for me, like why I wrote this book and like why I was okay with not making everybody happy because it wasn't, you know, necessarily meant for everyone. And that was okay. This is why I wrote it. I wrote it for these readers. And that has been really special.
Vaishnavi, how about you?
Uh, it's been a really interesting journey when it comes to reader reception for me. So when Kaikeyi first came out, and this is the danger I will say, that I am obviously most of the stories that people retell are beloved stories, but when you're talking about somebody's religion, you're getting into a kind of different sphere of intensity. And it's happened to readers who have written about Muslim figures or Christian figures. It's not, or Jewish figures. It's not unique to me. But the original response was there were a group of readers, especially Hindu readers, women, who said to me, "This is the first book I've read where I feel represented," or "This voiced all of my concerns that I had," or "It made me feel closer to my religion, and I am so glad I read this." And that was really heartening and kind of why I was reading the book. And then there were also the, you know, "You are a disgrace to Hindus everywhere and you should die." And I got a lot of that. I got a lot of like death and assault threats. And that was shocking because I thought that there were people who were going to be upset. I didn't have delusions that this was going to be everybody's cup of tea or that everybody was going to be comfortable with the liberties I've taken. But the virulence with which people basically said to me, "You decided to talk about women and how they have been sidelined or maligned in our religion, and now I'm going to threaten you," was shocking. And I had started writing Goddess of the River before Kaikeyi came out, and I'm so glad I did because I think in the first maybe 6 months after Kaikeyi came out, I did not have the confidence as an author to probably write as bold of a story as I wanted to anymore because I was just so shaken by receiving this kind of hate that I was like, maybe I should have toned it down. And now, 3 years from Kaikeyi, I can say, actually, no, like the fact that I was getting this response shows that I was saying something worth saying, and I'm pleased with what I put out, and I stand by it. And overall, it has been a much more positive than negative experience. But the original outpouring of vitriol was more shocking than I expected, and has not been the case for Goddess of the River or for 10 Incarnations of Rebellion, in the same, like, how dare you discuss our religion kind of way. I think because people saw that it didn't outwardly seem to affect me the first time around, so they kind of gave up.
Thank you, all three of you, for sharing your experiences post-publication in that way, especially with how vulnerable they were. That's some intense reactions to your stories, and I am glad that there was joy received as well. We're right around the hour mark, and so I'm going to transfer over to audience questions. I'll just be reading you a bit of them, telling you who they're from. And if you guys want to jump in, I'm gonna guide the conversation less, just say what you would like to say, and I'll continue onward. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but we might end up wrapping up a little early. So, first is from M. M says, I find it very hard to begin writing my story. I have over 20 years of weathered, busted spiral notebooks with thoughts and emotions that I have captured at the time I felt and thought them. What advice can you give on how to formulate the material and not feel overwhelmed?
I can jump in. So I also have thousands of notebooks with just the most random things in them. I have a notes app that is just ridiculous. So I understand that kind of having a really having that kind of lightning strike moment and putting the thought down and saying, okay, maybe I can make something out of this, and then leaving it alone. So I understand that. I think that for writers, that's a really universal truth. But for me, the the act of writing has become for me, it's just about consistency. And that consistency doesn't mean I'm at my desk like every day, 2,000 words a day. It's not like that. It's just like I'm going to go back to this one story, this thing that kind of moves me most, and I'm going to work on that until I am done. And that for me means allowing myself to write a really messy first draft, just to let it be, because you're not going to share this with anyone. You're just telling yourself the story. Giving yourself permission to write a really messy first draft, I think is is really freeing in a way, and also kind of giving yourself that permission to kind of finish the story, because you got to finish, and that is like the most boring, you know, practical advice, but it really is about picking something, deciding, okay, this is the one I'm going to stick with, and finishing that first draft. It's easier said than done. I know.
The one thing I'll add very briefly, I think that was spot on and exactly right, is that sometimes, and I have this feeling sometimes, that everything that interests me has to be in this book. And wanting to just cover everything, and then it becomes such an overwhelming task that you can't do it. And to think about what is this book about, and it doesn't have to be about everything I've ever thought about and cared about, has been very freeing for me. And there's things in coming books that I was thinking about during Kaikeyi and haven't managed to fit in for like 4 books, and that's okay. You just have to. Not every important thought is going to make it in, and you have to be able to let some of the things go.
Thank you, guys. We have another question from Braden Freeman, who says, good evening, all. Thank you for all of this information so far. My question, I assume during your process of remixing and retelling that you are constantly adjusting the ratio of original fairy tale slash novel to new content. What tips can you give about how to comfortably measure in my own work whether the ratio is too high in one direction or another?
I think a lot of it depends on like what it is that you want to do with your retelling, right? So this answer is going to change a lot just based off of the particular retelling you want to tell. So, I mean, there are retellings and, remixes that are like briefly inspired by the story. And then there are ones that are like very close to the original story from like setting to characters involved. And then there's a whole vast in between. So I think what has been key for me when I've been working on retellings is figuring out very early where do I want to land? Like what do I want my retelling to look like? What do I want to say with my retelling? And then once I have that framework, it makes it a lot easier to kind of figure out, okay, how much am I deviating here? Like, do I want to create a new setting? Do I want to put in a different time? Do I want to completely change certain characters? How do I want to deviate personally? And once you kind of have a better idea of how far you want to do it, then it comes to looking at your plot and deciding, like, okay, say I want it to be pretty close in, ABC ways, but I want my characters to be, fairly different. And that's when you look at your plot and say, okay, how are these scenes different? What beats do I want to hit? What do I think is not as important to hit? What can I change? What can I, omit entirely? And the answer is going to vary a lot just depending on what it is that you want to do with your particular story. And then figuring out the balance later is often where critique partners will come in. And, I find it really helpful to work with people who both are familiar with the original story and aren't familiar with the original story, so you can get a really good perspective of like, do people who aren't familiar with the story still find this interesting? Do they can they still follow the story? And then also, are people um, who are familiar with the original story able to see what I was doing here? Like, is there still a resemblance, or is there too much resemblance? And so that balance is definitely something I play with a lot while I'm working on revisions and, getting feedback and trying to make sure I want to hit what I was trying to do with that particular story. But I think the key thing too is there isn't necessarily like a right or wrong answer as to like how much or how little. It really just depends on what it is that you're trying to accomplish with your retelling.
We have another question from Taylor Howell, which is, how would you say the approach to retelling slash remixing slash reimagining a story changes when writing for different audiences, i.e. YA, new adults, adult, middle fiction, etc.?
I've written middle grade, young adult, and adult. So I think really the key difference is pacing. I think when you're kind of thinking about a story, regardless of what kind of story it is, but in remixes and retellings as well, it younger readers need a different type of pacing, especially today's readers. If we're really talking about, we're really paying attention to literacy trends and what young readers are picking up and what they keep picking up or what they put down. I think we young readers need to be engaged quickly, and they like a page turner, and they love a good story, but that pacing needs to be just a little quicker. I think the younger that you go, adult readers sometimes have a preference, but I find with adult readers and even young adult readers that there's a little more leeway with the pacing. I still think in YA you have to be very aware of that pacing as well, because today's YA readers are looking for something that's going to keep them engaged. And so I'm not necessarily talking about like fight scenes and action, but there has to be something there that keeps them turning the pages. So I would say pacing is the key difference between those different age categories.
I totally agree with that. I also want to add, I think the other thing that I have thought about, I've only done YA and adult to be as context, um, is when I was thinking about, for example, most ardently in Pride and Prejudice for YA, I was thinking about, okay, how am I making these conversations in Pride and Prejudice relevant to teens? Most teens today aren't thinking about marriage. They aren't thinking about finding the one quite yet, or maybe they are, but not thinking about getting married tomorrow. So that was one thing that I was thinking about a lot while I was considering most ardently, because I was writing for an audience who do not consider themselves adults, but thinking about an original work that where they are very much considered adults in society. And so that was, thematically one thing I wanted to keep in mind while I was writing YA, to make sure that I could translate the story in a way that was relatable and made sense. And then, for adult readers, I didn't have to think about that kind of translation as much. Persuasion is, in particular, has an older character, so that was one thing that made it a little bit easier for me, where I was like, okay, I don't have to translate this like 28-year-old to a 17-year-old. I can write about marriage and the more like mature, what does it mean to be, what does it mean to be an adult? What does it mean to be a 28-year-old who isn't married in England in this particular time? And themes that were more relevant to adult readers, I could just stick with that and I didn't have to tweak with it quite as much.
We have another question from an anonymous asker that says, "Thank you all. I'm curious about how much your anticipation and anxiety around how people would respond to these beloved stories shaped your writing experiences. As in, before you'd been published and were receiving feedback, how do you overcome that anxiety?"
So I can take a stab at that since I had nothing to add to the last one, since writing for young readers is too difficult for me and I am too afraid to tackle it. I actually think it's like harder than writing adults. Don't come at me. But I knew that there was going to be some negative response to my work because I knew I was specifically criticizing elements of a religion. So you know in that case that somebody's going to be mad. And what really helped me was imagining that I was writing for my sister and just thinking about what her response and reactions would be. And whenever I pictured my audience, I just thought of my sister. And that made it doable to go through the whole process and to think carefully about what was going to excite a reader and be interesting without thinking about, are they going to jump down my throat? Because I knew that she wouldn't. And so that has continued to be my tactic, actually. Whenever I write, I think about writing for my sister. And so she's a very discerning reader. She has told me for book 2, my first draft, she was like, you need to rewrite this. And then I did, and she was right. So it's not that it's for craft a low standard, but for what people are going to say to you or think about you messing with different pieces of a story. Think of somebody who you know who enjoys books but will be sympathetic to it, and imagine that you're writing for them. If you think about the whole world of readers that exist, it's going to be so anxiety inducing, and not just from the perspective of people could criticize you for messing with the story, but people might like a romance in their book and you haven't written a romance, or people might not like a romance in a book and you have written a romance, or people might want the characters aged up or aged down. Readers have and are going to find a way to tell you a million pieces of competing feedback, and so thinking about that beforehand can prevent you from writing. And so I just recommend thinking about your ideal reader as being very small and specifically defined, so that way you're not trying to pre-incorporate all of this feedback.
I do want to say also one thing that helped me with writing YA in particular, and this is very similar, is rather than thinking of somebody I knew, I was thinking of a younger version of myself. And so I'd often ask myself, like, okay, what is the version of the story that my younger self needed to see? And what is the version of the story that my younger self didn't get to see? And that for me felt both really affirming and that I was able to focus on what it is that like I knew I would have needed at that time and that I knew would have helped me without getting too in the weeds about like somebody's opinion, because like they're still me, they're just a younger version of me and a version that needed the information that I have now. And so how can I write a story that maybe would have helped them figure out who they are faster, or maybe would have helped them feel less alone? And I think by being able to focus on a reader, right? Whether it's somebody else or another version of yourself that is going to embrace the story and is going to be kind, is like very helpful for being able to kind of push the anxiety. Because ultimately, for me, I knew that while I was writing for a version of myself that is no longer present, there is somebody out there who is like in a similar position to that person, to that version of teen me. And so having that perspective, made it a lot easier for me to focus on like who is the story actually for? It isn't for the people who I know are gonna dislike it. Like, who is this for? How can I help that particular person? How can I help that particular reader? And that just made writing the story feel much more approachable and, less terrifying. Um, Even when I knew that, obviously there are going to be other readers out there. So I think being able to hone in on the one and being able to focus can really help push back the anxiety.
I think that that is a great note to end on. That was really wonderful. Thank you all so much for your responses. Thank you so much for Kalynn, Gabe, and Vaishnavi for joining us tonight. I hope you'll support these wonderful writers by buying their books. So please check them out at the link in the chat box. And thank you so much for those of us who joined here on Zoom and those of us who are joining the stream on YouTube now and in the future. Thank you so much. Happy writing, everyone. Now we'll hang out as people are filing out. You can hop out whenever you would like to. But thank you guys so much for coming. We'll cut off the recording before my personal goodbyes.